We've got a murder mystery. What causes the death of good feelings? What you're going to find is it's not so much a process like the Industrial Revolution or market revolution, and it's not so much a development like the recreation of the Bank of the United States and the enactment of a tariff. Those things don't help matters, but ultimately, this period of bipartisanship in U.S. history is not going to be killed by a process, but by a person. And that person is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is one of those figures in American history that, love him or hate him, and people have strong feelings about that even today, it's essential to understand him. And it's also one of those periods in U.S. history where history starts to become biography. Academic historians tend to sort of look down their nose at biography. And there are some reasons for that. But biography can also tell you a lot. The thing is that some people in history do have quite a lot of power and influence, and Andrew Jackson is one of those people. And understanding kind of who he is and where he comes from is important in understanding the things that he does, spoiler, after he gets elected president of the United States. The other point, though, is that Jackson is important not just because of his idiosyncrasies, who he is. He's important because of who he represents. You might remember back in period 2 when we were talking about Bacon's Rebellion, and that the character of Nathaniel Bacon, this person who sort of represents Westerners on the frontier who feel ignored by the central government. You see several Nathaniel Bacon-esque characters throughout this course, and Andrew Jackson is debatably the most important and the most significant of them all. But I also titled this The United States of Jackson. And one of the reasons for this is that if you're thinking about the Trans-Appalachian West, in other words, this Western territory that is kind of being settled in the 1780s and 1790s, you can see traces of Andrew Jackson virtually everywhere you look. So this is a list of counties, by the way, just as an example, that are named for important political figures. And of course, as you would imagine, there's a lot of stuff for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And of course, some things for Benjamin Franklin, especially in northern states. But then what's really surprising is if you look at it, Andrew Jackson in orange almost dwarfs the others. I should note, this is only looking at county names. If you look at cities, maybe you've heard of Jackson, Mississippi, or Jacksonville, Florida, Andrew Jackson's legacy is hiding in plain sight. And it's kind of appropriate that he should be named for places because he kind of is the representation of manifest destiny, of Americans moving into the West and making a life for themselves. But you can also see that he's very common, or the name is very common, in areas of the South, especially in our neck of the woods, it should be noted, and in the Trans-Appalachian West. So, obviously, if you've ever seen a $20 bill, and I hope you have, by the way, you probably know that Andrew Jackson is elected president. But if you think about where we are in the course, that shouldn't be taken for granted. The fact that Andrew Jackson is elected president might or should be maybe just a little surprising. Because remember that Jackson, the last time we checked in with Jackson, he had just defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in a war that, well, let's just say did not really go in our favor. Jackson was, maybe one of 2 military commanders for the United States in the War of 1812 that wasn't a complete moron. The other, by the way, being a person by the name of Winfield Scott that we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the Mexican-American War. But, not being a moron doesn't really give you the foundation to lateral from a military career to a political one, especially a political one that will take Jackson directly to the presidency. Um, so, in order to understand the other reasons why Andrew Jackson becomes so important during this time period, is we have to understand, what's going on in the late 18 teens and early 1820s, because it wasn't all roses and daisies. Why? Well, because we have something called the Panic of 1819. You don't have to be a somebody with genius level literary abilities to predict that the Panic of 1819 wasn't exactly a positive development. In fact, the Panic of 1819 is an economic depression. We'll talk about a series of panics in this course. The Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857, the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, and the biggest of them all, the Panic of 1929, also known as the Great Depression. There's a lot of panic in this course. Now, if that overwhelms you, I'm letting the panic sort of settle in for a moment. It should be noted that there's kind of a cyclical pattern to this. These panics seem to kind of occur, maybe not like clockwork, but within 15 to 20 years of one another. And one of the reasons for this, and one of the reasons why we're talking about panics now as opposed to earlier in the course, is that one of the reasons why we see panics is the development of capitalism. We talked about the market revolution and how that is revolutionizing commerce and trade. And one of the consequences of this is that it accelerates the development of capitalism. For those of you who don't know, we've talked a little bit about Adam Smith, who's kind of seen as the prophet of capitalism. But capitalism is used in many different connotations. The simplest definition is that capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production is held in private hands or private control. Means of production, by the way, is a fancy term that we use to say something that produces a lot of wealth for people. So factories, property, anything that creates wealth is held in private hands as opposed to being controlled by the government. Now, because the government, even under the revised Constitution, is so small, well, the United States is kind of tailor-made for a capitalist economy. Now, the way this kind of works is that in a capitalist economy, investors are encouraged to basically invest their money in things that will generate profit in the future. Now, nowadays, when we talk about investing, we typically mean buying stock in some kind of corporation. And by the way, that was already a thing by this point. But we also have to remember that corporations during this time period were kind of small. You were a big corporation during the market revolution if you had a company that comprised over 100 employees. But realistically, because of problems with communication, you couldn't really be much larger than that. If you think about just how difficult it is even today to manage a multinational corporation, during the early 1800s, you really couldn't have a corporation that really expanded beyond a state or so. Again, a very small geographic area. Basically, the thing that people invested in during this time period, or that most people who invested in, was land. To quote the great economist Lex Luthor from the first Superman movie, land is the only thing they're not making more of. Tectonically, that is not quite accurate, but we'll go with it. So, people are buying a lot of land. And the idea is that because land is by its nature scarce, it's finite, then land, the price of land, the value of land is only going to increase. So if you buy land now, well then by the time you're 50 or 60, you can sell that land and, I don't know, retire to the Cayman Islands or buy that beach house or something. And so that's actually kind of the motivation during this time period as well, that investors who want to invest their money in a place that's safe, they're going to buy land. Well, we also know that thanks to Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, there is a bunch of relatively cheap land in the West. So the other issue, though, is that, well, this is also land that's occupied by potentially hostile Native American tribes and the British, sometimes, even though they're not supposed to be there. But because of the War of 1812, well, they've kind of been pushed out. So now there's really no obstacle to buying land in the West and potentially even, maybe even actually building a farm on that land. So what happens is that there's this thing called a speculative boom in which suddenly people get excited about buying all of this land in the West. Going back to our discussion about cycles of panics, this boom is actually sort of woven into the fabric of capitalism. Because what capitalism kind of promises is that the good times economically are going to be super good. The bad times, though, are going to be catastrophic. And to be honest, this isn't really like even a political opinion. I know that sometimes like economics and you know, politics sometimes overlap, but you know, I think that most economists would kind of concede, even the defenders of capitalism would concede that what happens is that as the economy starts to increase, what also kind of happens is that there's inevitably going to be what we call a contraction, or what's euphemistically called a market correction. But if you're that person who loses their job, you're not going to refer to it as a market correction. You're going to refer to it as a recession or a depression or a whole bunch of sucky, you know, depending upon your personal preference. And again, that's, you know, kind of, that's implicit in capitalism itself. If you look at economies before the emergence of capitalism in the United States and in Great Britain during this time period, what tended to be the case is that because you didn't have factories or manufacturing centers, and because most economies were still agrarian, you had a whole bunch of sameness, where really the good times were just kind of but the bad times were pretty livable as well. So you might be wondering, well, Mr. Dry, what makes the bad times so bad with capitalism? Glad you asked. One thing that's associated with capitalism is the development of industries and commerce because of the market revolution and the industrial revolution. Now, these things are just starting out in the early 19th century, but this relationship between capitalism and industry is very, very strong. In fact, it's kind of rare to see one without the other until we get to the Soviet Union, which is a whole different story. Anyway, what happens is that when industries start to emerge, you don't just need resources, you don't just need money to start the business, you need workers, right? You need a large amount of workers who are, close to the factory site, which is why, by the way, most factories try to locate themselves in and around cities, or at least, highly populated areas. Well, that requires people to start leaving their homes and move towards the city. Now, the thing is that this is actually a discussion we'll bring back when we get to the Gilded Age, is that there is some give and take here. So on the one hand, it's not the case that every factory worker is going to live this life like out of a Charles Dickens book where they all have tuberculosis and they're being paid pennies because if their salaries were that bad, they wouldn't move to the city in the first place. Factory jobs were actually fairly stable. The problem is that they were also unpredictable. If you're a farmer and you own your own farm, well, when bad times happen, all you really need to do is just hunker down for a few years because, as a farmer, you are your own boss. If you lose your job and you own your own farm, you need to see a therapist because you're not farming right. So it basically means that you might not be able to buy very much. You might not be able to sell your crops, but as long as you're growing food and not just cash crops, you're probably not going to starve. Again, it wouldn't be anything to write home about, but you're going to be safe. And even if your farm is going through a rough patch, most farms are located, pretty close to, other farmers. I mean, there is kind of a support system built in. Now, the issue, though, is what happens when you move to the cities and away from that support system. Well, suddenly, if you lose your job, not only can you not just hunker down for a few years, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. So what this means is that for people in these cities, it means that suddenly these panics aren't just about let's say how much money you have. It's also a life or death situation, conceivably. So that gives you an idea of how panics work in a capitalist and industrial economy in general. But now let's talk a little bit more specifically about the Panic of 1819. And one of the nice things about, let me be fair. So panics are not just bad because of the people they impact, they're also bad because they're complicated. But if you understand one, you more or less understand them all. But it is also important that you kind of understand maybe not all the technicalities, but you understand kind of how they work in general. So one thing that almost always happens immediately before a depression or, again, a contraction is, believe it or not, the economy looks pretty good. So what happens immediately before a depression is that you see this period of economic growth where the economy is expanding. But sometimes, believe it or not, the economy can expand too fast. One thing that can sometimes cause the economy to expand too fast is, oh yeah, that's right, the Louisiana Purchase, where suddenly the size of the country gets effectively doubled. Now what's happening is that there's this enthusiasm for more and more land. So state banks basically feed into that by loading people paper notes or extending a line of credit. Again, by the way, remember that paper currency during this time period is actually pretty abstract. Each individual bank basically issues their own notes. So they would issue these notes so people could then turn around and buy land. And very often, by the way, they would buy land from the federal government. Well, remember that thanks to Henry Clay, we now have a second Bank of the United States that is collecting all that federal revenue. So theoretically, it's a win-win. The federal government gets revenue. Individuals, especially, farmers who tend to be more skeptical of the federal government in general, feel kind of pleased because they get cheap land. So it's kind of, a win-win theoretically, if, and only if, that money is being lent out responsibly. The thing is that state banks weren't lending out that money responsibly. They were, basically the way it works is that theoretically when state banks lend out money, for every $1 that they loan people in credit, they should have $1 backed by gold in the vault. Realistically, that's never going to happen. So what was considered an acceptable ratio is that for every $5 extended in credit, banks should have at least $1 of currency backed by gold or silver. Because remember, what currency basically entitled you, what paper money entitled you to do, is that if you had a dollar, if you were the bearer of that dollar, the bearer of that note, that entitled you to go to the bank that issued that note and get $1 in gold or silver. Of course, the problem is, well, what if suddenly everybody decides that they'd like gold or silver, especially if you're living in a bad economy? Well, that's a problem because the banks don't have that money on hand. So just kind of keep that in mind. Anyway, that being said, what we're kind of seeing is that as you see this increase in loans, you see inflation in the economy as a whole, where the money supply is growing because of the issuing of all these paper notes. But I know that we're living in a time in which the I word, inflation, is a bad word, and in most cases it is. But believe it or not, inflation is not necessarily bad. So if you're, remember that inflation is just the money supply expanding. Well, if money represents value and your economy is expanding because of, for example, more land in the West, then shouldn't your money supply also expand? A little bit of inflation makes sense. So if your national economy, for example, is growing by 3% a year, then believe it or not, inflation, your currency inflating by 3% is not only not a bad thing, it's probably necessary, because deflation, too little money for too much goods, too many goods, that's also a bad thing. So you need that even proportion, right? The problem is that because of capitalism and the emergence of capitalism, sometimes it's very, very hard to get that proportion correct. Sorry, go away, Zoom. But I hope you don't go away, because we have to introduce another character into this drama, and that is the Bank of the United States. Because if one of the arguments, by the way, of having a central bank is it allows the economy to be more managed. So remember that, part of the problem that we're seeing here is that the money supply is expanding, and the question is it expanding faster than the economy is actually growing? The short answer is yes. But one thing that a bank gives you, a central bank gives you, is the ability to regulate how much money is actually being circulated. If that bank is being run responsibly. The problem is that the Second Bank of the United States was not being run responsibly. So what's going on is that when the bank was chartered in 1816, either James Madison or James Monroe nominates Mr. William Jones as the first bank president. Now, William Jones was not an economist. That's not a cardinal sin, by the way, because economics wasn't really even a discipline during the early 1800s, but you need to know a little bit about banking to become the president of a bank, and yeah, Jones didn't. So the issue is that rather than encouraging state banks to stop issuing out these loans, the Second Bank of the United States encourages it. And part of that is because William Jones is a politician. He knows that there's a desire for people to move into the West, and that is politically, that's seen as politically favorable. And also, it's a good idea for the federal government to be seen looking out for the interest of the little guy. Because it's not the people who already have money who are going and getting these loans, mostly. It's, ordinary people, for the most part. So this, for more political reasons than economic reasons, the Second Bank of the United States backs state governments issuing all of these loans. So again, though, none of this would be bad if the land that was being purchased in the West was all it was cracked up to be. Um, so what's going on is that people are getting more and more excited about this land, and that's driving the price up. Well, um, for those of you who are a little skeptical about this, think about, I don't know, maybe you've seen one of these, people waiting in line for the next iPhone or something. So what tends to happen is that before a product, there's, especially in tech, right? There's a lot of enthusiasm for that product. And then once people actually buy that product, they realize that it's not going to cure cancer. They realize that you have to buy a bunch of loot boxes if you're buying anything from EA. They realize just all the imperfections there. They realize that the latest iPhone requires you to give up your earbuds. And then sort of in disgruntlement, you eventually trade it in for a fraction of the value. Why? Because you realize that it's not really as valuable as you thought it was. Well, that's the problem. What happens if people realize that all that land is not as valuable as they thought it was? And so they decide, they have these loans, they decide to sell that land. Let's say that they bought that land for $100 and they realize they can't actually sell that land for $10. In other words, you're $90 in the hole. And during that time period, that would be a lot of money. So what happens is that the second bank does an about face in 1818, where they basically try to freeze credit. In other words, discourage people from getting more and more loans. What kind of happens, though, is that suddenly sends the economy into a free fall, and that creates the Panic of 1819. So when we look at panics today, one way we kind of look at the impact of economic panics is to look at employment. Now, remember, we talked about how employment in an agrarian economy is very different than employment in an industrial economy. In an agrarian economy, unless you are like a sharecropper, you are your own boss. Or maybe you work for your mom or your dad, right? But by and large, it's a very entrepreneurial business. So you don't have to worry about being fired. You just have to worry about whether or not you're actually going to make any money on the crops that you're growing. So in an industrial economy, though, you are completely dependent upon a corporation. Or whoever it is that you work for. So the thing is that in 1819 the country is still very agrarian. So whereas the Great Depression is kind of famous for having a 25% unemployment rate, which is astronomical. I know that we've if you're watching this in 2020, we recently saw numbers that look pretty similar to that, but they've stabilized pretty quickly as the economy is reopening. But 25% unemployment for a prolonged period of time, was absolutely unprecedented during the Great Depression. But you do see some similarities in 1819. So in Philadelphia, for example, roughly 75% of the urban population was out of work, was unemployed. In New York, the foreclosure rate was such that almost a quarter of the population was homeless. So out of a city of roughly 123,000 people. By the way, New York is kind of like the nerve center of the market revolution. 30,000 people were made homeless. So here's the thing. In American history, I would argue that we're still sort of influenced by John Smith's command in Jamestown that if you don't work, you don't eat, which is admittedly very cruel, almost like Darwinian. But at the same time, if there is an argument in favor of that philosophy, it's, look, we got a lot of land here and not a lot of people. this is a country where if you're born with nothing, you could very easily die with something, at least during this time period. You have to make sure you don't die of disease or that kind of thing. But to be honest, a lot of people at that time period took the view that if you end up destitute, if you're impoverished, if you lose your farm or home, there must be something wrong with you. Admittedly, that's pretty harsh. But at the same time, in the 1750s, if you and your family find yourselves starving, is that because of something that the Bank of England did to interest rates? Or is that more likely because maybe you forgot or just didn't feel like planting seeds for the harvest? So, in other words, in an agrarian economy, you're more insulated from the wider effects of the national economy. But what Americans face for really the first, but not the last time in 1819, is that good people, people who do everything right, people who work hard, might find themselves out of a job and out of a home for no other reason than something that was entirely beyond their control. And again, if you are a factory worker specifically and you're living in a city, you suddenly find yourselves out of a home and out of a job. What do you do then? Well, obviously, you didn't do anything to deserve that, but here you are. So there's no family to take care of you. There's obviously your employer is not taking care of you because they either fired you or your employer's business itself went into bankruptcy. So who's going to take care of you? And if you understand that, you understand why there's this slow but steady march towards the idea of having government actually provide some assistance for people who find themselves in that situation. But unfortunately, at this period of time, there was no federal government to help people out. I mean, the federal government existed, but helping people out, providing welfare was not one of the functions of government during this time period. So whether you were a factory worker or if you were like Andrew Jackson, a property owner in a western state, you were out of luck. And many people basically lost everything. Andrew Jackson almost did, believe it or not. But this is something that goes a long way to explain why Americans feel a sense of frustration against the government. And it's a frustration that takes a while to build, but something that happens is that during this time period, remember, you only have one political party, the Democratic Republicans. And so this sort of sets the stage for this general sort of revulsion against government across the board. But maybe this would be completely irrelevant if not for another political development that occurs right around the time of the Panic of 1819. So one of the questions that the Panic of 1819, brought up is, what do you do to people who've lost their homes? Because, losing your home is bad enough. But if you remember, having a home, having property wasn't just your ticket to a better life. It was your ticket to basically being a member of society, where voting rights were based on whether you own land. Well, if you lose your house, do you lose the right to vote? Well, you can kind of imagine that if that was the case, you would basically have another round of Shays' Rebellion. If, on top of feeling a sense of anger against the political establishment, you would have no way to voice it because you couldn't vote. So this goes a long way to explain why slowly but surely, during the 19th century, you do see some electoral college reform. Remember that at this point, you have state legislators who elect electors, and the electors then turn around and elect the president. Now, what we're also seeing is that you're seeing the abolition of property requirements to vote, slowly but surely. Um, but you also have some reforms at the state level, which change the way the Electoral College is supposed to work. So what happens is, instead of you voting for your state legislator and your state legislator turning around and voting for an elector, what happens is that you vote for a presidential candidate. By voting for a presidential candidate, you elect, you're not actually electing that candidate, but you are electing a slate of electors that then turn around and vote for that candidate. So, like everything else associated with the Electoral College, this is kind of complicated. But here's what you really need to understand. The first is that this is kind of contorting the Electoral College to do something that it wasn't supposed to do. In other words, we're making presidential elections democratic. And of course, this is coming during a time period in which Americans feel that they have a lot to be democratic about, or at least, express their democratic opinions about. But it's kind of like taking a limousine and attaching a truck bed to the end. Having a limousine and having a truck, I mean, there's nothing wrong with really either of these two things, depending upon what your needs are. The question is, how are you going to awkwardly combine those two things? The Electoral College is not meant to be democratic. It's meant, in some respects, to minimize democracy, at least in presidential elections, because remember, the founders were very worried about the prospect of a president who is popular. Too popular. They want a president who, in other words, can sometimes rule without or govern without democracy. And that seems undemocratic, right? But that's the point, right? So what this means is that not only is the Electoral College, and by extension, the Constitution, going to function very differently than was intended, but you also get very different kinds of candidates that will run for political office. The candidates that will kiss babies and do all kinds of goofy things to run for office. Remember that if you go back to George Washington didn't run for office. He stood for office. In other words, running for office was undignified. He just let it be known that he would be available to serve as president. And if he was hired by the electors, he would serve. But he wasn't going to condescend and actually run, go out and give speeches, and that's just undignified. And I mean, really the only real experience that Washington has with politics at the ground level is apparently when he was running for a seat in the House of Burgesses. He spent a whole lot of money on cider, got his community together, got them drunk, and apparently became popular enough that they voted him into office. I might be misremembering that, but beyond that, when George Washington, after he became commander of the Continental Army, George Washington didn't shake people's hands. He bowed. Politicians were almost aristocratic in their demeanor. And so if you look at George Washington, or especially people like John Adams and James Madison, none of these candidates were candidates that had that were popular in the traditional sense. And they didn't have to be, because the Electoral College existed to allow for candidates like Adams and Madison to be elected. When you think about seismic events in American political history, it's easy to think of things like the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote, or the Civil War amendments, amendments number 13 through 15, which, spoiler, free African Americans from slavery, grant them citizenship, and in most cases, at least for a time, the right to vote. The development that I'm going to talk about is just as important, even if it doesn't occur through a single act of legislation. Because without this development, these other developments would not occur. And that is what we see in the early 19th century, from the 18 teens culminating into the 1830s. We see the United States definitively choose democracy. And remember that even though the Constitution begins with "we the people," there wasn't anything predetermined or fated about America's love affair with democracy. There, as the old saying goes, demographics is destiny, and the fact that we're increasingly becoming a society that lives on the frontier, the population is, growing larger, and because the country is becoming more entrepreneurial. I mean, all of these factors kind of leads to a more democratic direction. But I mean, that's also, by the way, a fascinating question. Say, by the way, here's what I'd like you to do. In your period 4 portfolio, I would like you guys to answer the following question in a short paragraph. And that is, why do you think Americans, or the United States, choose democracy? Why democracy? And this is one of those things where I kind of know what you could answer, but I'm also very, very curious as to what you come up with, because I think there could be some room for argument. But short paragraph on why we choose democracy, if that is even a choice. And I think you can kind of, make an argument either way. But so the fact that elections do become more democratic, we now directly elect electors. That's a mouthful, means that you see a couple of developments. First is that slowly but surely, from really the end of the American Revolution up until about the 1830s, we see the adoption of universal white male suffrage. This is not obviously universal suffrage, and there are obviously all kinds of restrictions that impede one's ability to vote. But what we can say is that the trend that we already talked about is that after the American Revolution, there is this trend to extend the right to vote to all adult males. And by the way, the age of adulthood can vary by state, but all adult males have the right to vote, regardless as to whether or not they own property. So, in other words, the electorate is less rich, is less wealthy, and so kind of reflecting that is the fact that if the electorate is growing much larger because suddenly propertyless males can vote, well then suddenly there has to be some kind of effort to reach out to them. And that leads to what's called popular campaigning. Really, it's kind of the emergence of campaigning as we know it today, where politicians travel the country, giving speeches and drumming up support. And, you might remember that, George Washington, for instance, was somebody who consented to stand for office but not run for office. So, in other words, this is one of those things we could easily take for granted, but is really important. If you wanted to run for president, the only people that you really had to appeal to, at least on paper, would be members of state legislatures that would elect electors, typically from one of their own ranks. Now, you actually have to have a message that's compelling to a big chunk of the country. Now, that being said, some people are, you can't be everywhere at once, and it's hard to travel anywhere. I mean, yeah, we have the steamship. Yeah, we have a few toll roads and that kind of thing. But realistically, until railroads start to take off, and they haven't, by the way, it's going to take a while to get anywhere in the United States. So what that means is that even if you basically, I guess George Whitefield could run for president, remember, who spends most of his life, it seems like, going from one end of the country to the other. But still, I think Whitefield only managed to talk to and minister to a paltry 1 million people. I don't know, that's probably enough, but still, that's like 20 or 30 years worth of effort. And as a campaigner, you have 1 to 2 years to really to get people enthusiastic about whatever it is you believe in. So what happens is that political parties become stronger and more powerful and more organized to basically get people to come out and support their candidates. Now, sometimes, I mean, this is an election year. We've kind of seen instances where people get out and campaign and caucus basically because they believe in stuff. Right? It's kind of like the schoolhouse rock version of American politics, where people are purely motivated by their sincerely held political beliefs. But I hope this is going to be coming as a shock to some of you, but not everybody, behaves like that. Some people are more interested in. Have more selfish motivations. And for those individuals, we have the spoil system. Now, the spoil system is not some kind of refrigeration system. In fact, the spoil system is basically, it comes from the phrase, to the victor goes the spoils. And we see it in the elections in the 1820s and 30s, but it's also something that we see up until the present day. Basically, if you want to get an idea of what the spoil system is in principle, it's basically a transactional view of politics. So if, for example, you've been a good little trooper and you've gone out and campaigned for a politician and you have gotten a lot of your friends and neighbors, maybe even your community, excited about somebody's candidacy, then that gives you the right after that president, or it doesn't have to be president, it could be any politician, but for the sake of things, let's say president. After that president wins their election, well, you get to go to that president and ask for a job. It could be any job. Because remember, the president, as head of the executive branch, controls all government departments, which also includes jobs ranging from Secretary of State, Postmaster General, to even lowly positions. So the idea of the spoil system is that the better you do for a candidate, the better the job you can request. And very often these jobs could be basically launch pads for, basically advancing further in your political career. Or it could just be kind of a do-nothing job where you just sit there and twiddle your thumbs, get a comfortable paycheck, and kick back and relax. But now, let's back up. Some people might say, well, Mr. Dry, so you're telling me that if you campaign ardently for a politician, they can give you a job? Yes. Well, isn't that, a bribe? Well, thank you for asking that 3 a.m. That's a very good question. No, it's not a bribe. Bribes involve money. You're not, bribing somebody. You're simply giving a job that happens to pay money to a person who has earned it, a person who deserves it. But, Mr. Dry, so the president just nominated somebody to be Secretary of the Treasury, and the guy can't count. Well, I mean, but that's true, but there's that's not a requirement. And two, the president has a fair amount of discretion in selecting whomever he or she thinks best to fill that position. And the thing is, if you're thinking about democracy, then in a democracy, isn't the fact that that an elected official selected by the people isn't the idea of them choosing their own people to fill government positions democracy in action? Maybe. Is it also possibly corrupt? Maybe. These are all questions that we will revisit again and again because, spoiler about the spoils system, is here to stay. And whether you're talking about a mayor in a small town in Pennsylvania or the president of the United States, politicians from this point will find that their ability to hire and appoint people into government positions to be a huge source of their political power.